So this lady knocks on the door of this guy's house, and he opens up, and she says to him, "Sir, do you happen to own a black pit bull?" And the guy goes, "Yeah, I do. Why?" And she says, "Well, I'm very sorry to tell you, but he died." And the man says, "He died? What are you talking about? What do you mean? How did he die? What happened?" And she said, "Well, my miniature poodle killed it." "What?" the guy says. "How did your poodle kill my pit bull?" She said, "Well, it got stuck in his throat." Oh my God. Does the microphone work? Hello? Come on, that wasn't that bad. Should I just leave? That was terrible. Did not one person laugh? It got stuck in his throat. Forget it. I'm sorry. Sometimes the little things or the little ones surprise us. Sometimes that which seems kind of objectively small and probably weak, insignificant, a lot of times we're surprised. Those small ones, those small things, I think more often than we suspect, ultimately become big things. Sometimes the smallest have the biggest impact. There's this camp in Connecticut. Some of you sure have heard about it. It's a camp for kids with cancer and other very serious illnesses. It's called the Hole in the Wall Gang. Paul Newman, the actor, he founded it about 35 years ago, and it's kind of an interesting place. It's got a great reputation. It's really just like an escape. What he wanted to do, Newman, was create this experience for kids who are suffering and for their families, but the kids primarily, just to give them a week to just, as much as possible, escape their circumstances. So they just created this very fun, like, playground for these kids, and equipped with all the medical aspects that would be needed for kids with particular needs. So a whole medical staff connected to it. But the way this camp began is kind of interesting. It was 1980, right before Christmas. Paul Newman, who also lives in Connecticut, he was preparing Christmas presents for his neighbors. He made this. He had this homemade salad dressing. I mean, you see it in the store, Newman's Own. Well, before it was in the stores, he was just kind of making it at home, and he had a big giant vat of it out in his garage: olive oil, vinegar, spices, and a whole bunch of empty wine bottles. So what he did was he made this salad dressing, put them in these wine bottles, and he gave them to his neighbors as a Christmas present. And they loved it. They were raving about this salad dressing. So they said, "You got to make more," and he did. And then they said, "You ought to sell this stuff. This is how good this salad dressing is." So he did. I mean, he thought the whole thing was a joke. He really wasn't looking to make any money. And then he said, "Well, no, maybe I will try to make money, and I'll make money for great causes." He wasn't looking to pocket any of it. So he invested $20,000 and his neighbor $20,000, and they put that into this business, and it took off. They started selling it in local stores in Connecticut, and within 2 years they had $300,000, 100% of it going to charity, and he had a whole bunch of charities laid out, earmarked. And then this idea of this camp came about, and that really became kind of the focus, where I guess most of the money went to. Now they serve 20,000 kids a year in these camps. And since the early 80s, when this began, they've raised $450 million from this, and he expanded it. He had lemonade and popcorn and all these other stuff, food products, 28 camps. So the thing just totally took off. If you go to their website, you can check out some of the kind of the testimonials, mostly from family, from parents of these kids, some from the kids themselves. And they just talk about the power of this camp and the impact and the influence it's had on the lives of these people getting choked up as they're talking about it. Just sort of life-changing, maybe even like life-saving experiences as a result of this camp. And it began with homemade salad dressing in his garage. It's kind of this like small thing becoming really big idea. That's what I was trying to say about the joke with the little dog and no? All right, I'm just going to put that to rest. There's I remember reading this story about, Make-A-Wish Foundation. They do such great work. And there was this guy who was dying. He had cancer. He was dying. And he had this, one of his bucket list items was to go to a Notre Dame football game. Always wanted to get there, and he just never did. And now, practically, he didn't really have the finances to get himself there. And, well, anyway, I guess friends reached out to Make-A-Wish, and they made it happen. So he got to this game, Notre Dame game, before he ultimately did die. But one of his friends was just talking about the Notre Dame football experience, and they just said it's like, it really is something you should do before you die. The football piece is kind of secondary. I mean, if you're into that, that's great, but you don't even have to really care about the game so much. It's just the spirit and the tradition and the sense of community that is just kind of unbelievable in that stadium for those few hours on those Sundays. 180 years ago, 8 priests and brothers, religious brothers, 8 of them, from France and from Ireland, went out to South Bend. They had been given access to 500 acres of property, and they were told, go build a school. Their first class was 2 students, and it was a grade school. And now it's Notre Dame. God, I think, begins small. Often. I mean, not always, but often. God often begins, I think, below the radar, sort of almost off the grid. Like you'd miss it. You'd miss God if you weren't really on the lookout. Because very often God just shows up, I think, in kind of small, ordinary, humble ways. But eventually they become huge. They become life-changing and life-saving. Kind of like that camp. I mean, it's this gospel. It's this parable. He says the kingdom of God is like this. God is like this. And, we know this. We know the image. It's a mustard seed. This tiny, like you almost talk about walking by it and missing it if you weren't looking for it. Totally. You wouldn't recognize it at all. It's so tiny. And the seed becomes huge. It becomes something that you can't possibly miss. Man, but it begins real small. So easy to miss. So seemingly unimportant. In England, in Oxford, right by the university, there's this pub, this English pub. It's a bunch of pubs, I guess, but there's this one particular one, which back in the 1930s, this group of professors used to hang out at. On Tuesdays, they would meet up for lunch, a couple of drinks, and for lunch, and they would talk shop. They were literary guys, and they were philosophers. So what they do is they'd come for these drinks and a meal, and they would sort of they would talk to the others in the group. It was about 8 or 9 of them, kind of what they were writing, what they were up to. And the other guys would sort of critique it and say, yeah, that's good, or not so good. You ought to tweak it this way, that way. One of the members of this group was Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien. And they say that in a lot of ways, The Lord of the Rings was kind of born in that pub. The Hobbit. If you saw the pub, it just looks like any other pub. It doesn't look special. But what happened back in the 1930s was a pretty big deal, or became a big deal. Another member of that group was the great Protestant theologian C.S. Lewis, a great writer himself, the Chronicles of Narnia, and great theology. He was asked a question once about God and history, sort of like, how does God show up? How does God show up in our lives? How does God enter history? And he said this very quietly. God shows up very quietly in a dusty, forgotten corner of the Roman Empire, sneaking behind enemy lines. God's really not in your face. God's real humble. Just consider the way he was born into the world. Consider the Christmas story. That's what he was referencing. It's easy to miss. We know the details of the Christmas story. We're sure we would have walked by, spotted that stable or that cave or whatever it was he was born in, and we would be stopped in our tracks because somehow we would have known that this is God. I'm not so sure. It probably looked like any other stable or any other cave in Bethlehem. And that baby probably looked like any other little newborn baby boy. And same with his parents. Very humble, very easy to miss. And that's how God shows up, very quietly. So I think the challenge for us becomes, I better not miss him. God really isn't in our face very often. So that means I got to be more aggressive, more proactive, looking out for the presence of God. How does God show up in our lives? I was talking about this morning down at St. Ignatius at the 9:45 Mass, and a woman who I know in the parish, she came up to me. She's retired, as is her husband. He was there, but I saw him for a minute, and then he kind of kept going, but she stayed. And she told me this story. She said, I guess this was probably also about 40 years ago. Father Chuck Romano, he was a priest down at Ignatius. He was a brand new priest, newly ordained. And he came up to this couple, and he said to them, I'd like you to consider becoming Eucharistic ministers for the parish. And she immediately said, she looked at her husband and said, there's no way he's becoming a Eucharistic minister. Because he said, shines every Saturday night way too late. There's no way this guy should be distributing the Blessed Sacrament. She said you'd smell the beer on him the next morning as he was giving out communion. So she was like, she answered the question. She didn't even let the guy speak. She was like, no, he's not doing this. And then she said to me that 2 weeks later, he quit drinking. And she said he has not had a drink since that moment. And he became a Eucharistic minister. And he still is. Man, that invitation, that one little invite from that priest, that one suggestion, look how I don't know, I suspect in a big way his life was turned around based on her description of what life was like, the way he was living, probably wasn't going to end too well. But it ended very well. I mean, it's not over yet. But was it as simple? Was that the mustard seed? This priest just saying, I think you should think about doing this. I think that's more often how God does work. Those people who show up in our lives, and they'll say something to you. They're like, you know what? I think you should apply for that job. And you were thinking about it, but you weren't going to do it because you didn't really have the confidence. Maybe even somebody else discouraged the notion. So you kind of got rattled and you just sort of stepped away from the possibility until this person said, I think you could do this. So you did it. And you got the job. And I don't know, that then sent you to a different building. And you met somebody in that building that you fell in love with and became your husband or your wife. And now you got kids that wouldn't even be had you not met. And you never would have met had you not gone for the job. So you can kind of trace it back to that person saying, hey, go for this. I think you could do this. I don't know, was God just working through that person? Is it this mustard seed thing? I mean, objectively, okay, it's a sentence. I think you should apply for the job. And this little mustard seed turns into the whole arc of my life changed. Person I never knew existed became the love of my life. What if that person hadn't asked the question? I don't know, so maybe the challenge for us is to do two things. To recognize the mustard seeds and to be the mustard seeds. God begins small. So find him in the small.